The fall of 2019 was unusually warm. Abby Rose had just started working at Portland City Hospital and was full of enthusiasm despite the grueling schedule of shifts in the pediatric ward. At 30, she had finally landed her dream job and was planning to devote herself to her career without giving much thought to her personal life. That Thursday, she was working the morning shift. It was a busy day. The cold season was in full swing, and worried parents were constantly bringing in children with fevers and coughs. Around lunchtime, Abby's head started to ache, so she decided to go to a small cafe across the street from the hospital that served excellent coffee. The cafe was unusually empty. Abby ordered a double espresso and a sandwich when she heard someone behind her curse under their breath. Turning around, she saw a man trying unsuccessfully to wipe a coffee stain off his white shirt. "I have wet wipes," Abby offered, taking a packet out of her bag. She always carried them with her, a pediatrician's habit. "Thanks, but I'm afraid that won't help," the man smiled. "I have an important meeting in an hour. I'll have to stop by home to change. Then I suggest you blot the stain with some sparkling water." Abby took a bottle from the vending machine and handed it to the stranger. "I'm Abby. Nate Marshall," he smiled again, and fine lines spread from the corners of his eyes. "Do you work at the hospital? How did you guess? It says so on your badge." Nate nodded toward the ID card Abby had forgotten to remove. They struck up a conversation. Nate turned out to be a sales manager at Premium Motors and was indeed rushing to meet an important client. But before leaving, he asked for Abby's phone number. Their first date was a week later. Nate took her to a small Italian restaurant on the outskirts of town. Abby appreciated the choice of venue, no pretensions or frills, but with soul and excellent cuisine. They talked until almost midnight. Nate told her about his childhood in a small town in Idaho and how he moved to Portland in search of a better life. Abby shared stories from her medical practice. The first date was followed by a second, then a third. Nate proved to be attentive and caring. He sent Abby coffee to the hospital when she had night shifts, picked her up after her shifts, and took her out for breakfast. Once he even organized a small show with guest entertainers for the young patients in the pediatric ward. By winter, they were practically living together. Abby liked Nate's spontaneity, his ability to connect with different people, and his easygoing attitude toward life. She felt safe with him and could finally relax after her hard shifts at work. Their first serious argument happened before Christmas. Nate insisted that Abby go with him to meet his parents, but she couldn't cancel her shift. The hospital was short-staffed. They didn't even talk for a couple of days until Nate showed up at her work with a huge bouquet of flowers and tickets to Idaho for Thanksgiving the following year. "You're impossible," Abby smiled. "I know, but you still love me," he winked. At that moment, Abby truly realized she was in love with his smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes, his ability to turn any mishap into a joke, the way he remembered all her co-workers' favorite coffee drinks. She couldn't have imagined that this infatuation would lead to such consequences. But for now, they were just happy together, making plans for the future and enjoying every day. Nate continued to surprise her with little gifts, and Abby learned to be a little more spontaneous. It seemed like this idyll would last forever. Nate proposed on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. No musicians, fireworks, or crowds of spectators. Just the two of them on the couch in Abby's apartment after her day shift. She was reclining with her head on his lap, and he was absent-mindedly running his fingers through her hair, telling her about a funny customer at the car dealership. Then he suddenly stopped mid-sentence and asked, "Will you marry me?" Abby didn't even realize he was serious at first. She sat up, looked into his face, and only then noticed how tense his shoulders were and how nervously he was fiddling with the box containing the ring. "Yes," she simply replied. The ring was exactly what she loved, a thin gold band with a small diamond. Nothing fancy, just very elegant and simple. Abby often wondered how Nate had guessed her taste so well, even though they had never discussed jewelry. They decided not to delay the wedding. Abby didn't want a lavish celebration, and Nate thought it was better to spend the money on a honeymoon than on a pompous event. They got married at City Hall on an April morning when Portland was covered in cherry blossoms. Only their closest friends and family attended the ceremony. Nate's parents flew in from Idaho, and Abby was joined by her older sister Lisa and her husband. Abby's mother had passed away just 2 years earlier, and her daughter felt her absence keenly as she prepared for the ceremony. Her father had been living in Europe with his second family for a long time and sent only a greeting card. After the ceremony, they had lunch at the same Italian restaurant where they had their first date. The owner, who knew the couple well, went out of his way to make it special. The tables were literally groaning with food. Abby wore a simple white dress just below the knee, with several sprigs of cherry blossoms in her hair. Nate kept catching her eye across the table and smiling so happily that her heart skipped a beat. They spent their honeymoon traveling through northern Italy. They spent 2 weeks wandering through narrow streets, eating pasta in tiny trattorias, drinking wine on verandas, and rapidly gaining weight from Italian cuisine. Nate turned out to be an amazing traveler. He knew how to find places that weren't written about in guidebooks. When they returned home, they began to settle into a small house they had bought shortly before their wedding in the suburbs of Portland. The neighborhood was quiet and green, with good schools nearby, just right for a future family. Abby continued to work at the hospital. Nate still sold cars at the dealership, and their life flowed smoothly and calmly. On weekends, they usually worked on the house, painting walls, landscaping the yard, choosing furniture. Nate turned out to be surprisingly handy. He did a lot himself without calling in professionals. He also started a tradition of cooking experimental meals for Abby on Sundays. Not all of them were successful, but she appreciated his efforts. They often talked about children, but decided to wait for now. Abby wanted to become the head of her department first, and Nate was thinking about starting his own business. Besides, they enjoyed their life together. Spontaneous weekend trips, long breakfasts in bed, evenings watching TV series. Gradually, they grew closer, learned to compromise on small things and stand up for what was important. Abby realized that Nate couldn't stand it when she left cups of half-drunk coffee all over the house. He accepted that she sometimes had to rush off to the hospital in the middle of the night for an emergency call. Their first year of marriage was filled with discoveries about each other. For example, Abby learned that Nate talks in his sleep, sometimes in complete sentences, and he discovered her habit of singing in the shower, exclusively old rock ballads. On weekdays, their schedules often didn't match. She worked shifts, and he had a standard office day. But they tried to have dinner together every evening when possible. They told each other about their day and shared their plans. Nate always listened attentively to Abby's stories about her young patients, even though she suspected he didn't understand half of the medical terms. It seemed that they had found their own rhythm of life, calm, comfortable, with the right balance of work and rest. Perhaps their marriage seemed too ordinary to outsiders, but it was enough for them. At least, that's what Abby thought. On weekdays, Abby woke up at 5:30 a.m. Nate was usually still asleep, and she tried to get ready quietly so as not to wake him. The hospital started work at 7, but Abby liked to arrive early to review medical records, discuss difficult cases with her colleagues, and drink coffee in the quiet of the doctor's office. Working in the pediatric ward required not only professionalism, but also a special approach to young patients. Abby knew how to find common ground even with the most capricious children. She always had pencils and paper for drawing in her office and lollipops for brave patients in her coat pocket. Nate arrived at the car dealership around 9. Premium Motors specialized in expensive car brands, and each customer had to be dealt with individually. Nate was great at this. He knew how to win people over and find an approach to even the most demanding buyers. His bosses valued him for his consistently high sales. In the evenings, if Abby wasn't on call, they would meet at home. They would cook dinner, usually together, which had become a kind of ritual. Nate joked that after a whole day of talking to customers, he needed culinary therapy. Abby would tell him about her patients and sometimes ask his advice on difficult cases. Although Nate knew nothing about medicine, he was able to look at situations from an unexpected angle. They spent their weekends in different ways. Sometimes they would go out on the town, to the movies or to small restaurants that Nate somehow always managed to find. Sometimes Abby was called to the hospital. Children's illnesses don't take weekends off. Nate was understanding about this, although he sometimes grumbled that her patients saw her more often than he did. In her free time, Abby read medical journals or prepared for her next certification exam. She was seriously considering becoming head of the department, but that required her to stay up to date on the latest research and techniques. At such times, Nate usually pottered around in the garage. He had become fascinated with restoring an old motorcycle he had bought on a whim. Their house gradually filled up with little things that made it cozy. Photos from their travels appeared on the walls, and flowers that Abby diligently kept alive despite her busy schedule adorned the windowsills. Nate's garage became a real man cave with tools and spare parts. Routine is what Americans call everyday life. But there was a charm to this routine. Abby liked that Nate left her funny notes in the morning wishing her a good day. He appreciated that she always ironed his shirts in a certain way. It was a quirk of his. On weekdays, their schedules often didn't match. When Abby had a night shift, she would come home just as Nate was leaving for work. They would leave messages for each other on the refrigerator, a kind of family tradition. Sometimes it was just a smiley face. Sometimes a whole poem made out of magnetic letters. Things were going well for both of them at work. Abby had earned a reputation as an attentive and competent doctor. She was often referred difficult patients, and she was proud of her colleagues' trust. Nate consistently met his sales targets, and his photo appeared on the salon's honor board more than once. Their financial situation was stable, not luxurious, but quite comfortable for the middle class. They allowed themselves regular dinners at restaurants, short trips on weekends, and new appliances for the home. Abby even started saving money for her own small practice. It was her long-held dream. And so, the days passed. Weekdays were followed by weekends. Seasons followed one another. Their life rolled along on a well-worn track, and from the outside, everything looked fine. They regularly visited Nate's parents in Idaho, kept up with friends, and made plans for the future. Perhaps at some point this predictability began to seem too bland, but Abby was too busy with work and her career to notice the first signs that something was going on with Nate. He started staying late at work more often, and their dinner conversations became shorter. However, she chalked it up to normal fatigue and work stress. The changes in Nate's behavior began so gradually that at first Abby didn't think much of them. At first, he started staying late at work more often, explaining that he had meetings with clients. In the car business, it's common to have to work around the schedules of busy customers. Then Abby noticed that he was checking his phone more and more often with a nervous urgency. As soon as she got close, Nate would immediately lock the screen. When she looked at him questioningly, he would reply, "Just work emails." He had never hidden messages from her before. One morning, as she was getting ready for work, Abby noticed that their shared stash in the kitchen cupboard had noticeably shrunk. They both sometimes took money from there for small expenses, but always let each other know. This time, Nate didn't say anything. "Honey, did you take money from the cupboard?" she asked at breakfast. "Oh, yes. I wanted to surprise you on the weekend," he replied, without looking up from his phone. The weekend came and went. There was no surprise. Abby decided not to dwell on it. Who knows what reasons he might have had? At that time, she had a difficult patient, a girl with a rare form of anemia, and Abby often stayed late at the hospital studying similar cases in medical literature. Perhaps that's why she didn't immediately notice that Nate was coming home later and later, sometimes after midnight. He smelled like cigarettes, even though he had quit smoking before their wedding. When she asked him about it, he dismissed it, saying that a client had been smoking like a chimney all day and the smell had rubbed off on him. But the smell kept coming back. At some point, Abby realized that they were eating dinner together less and less often. Nate was either too busy, had a snack with clients, or simply said he wasn't hungry. Their evening conversations became shorter and shorter. Now he rarely asked about her work and spoke reluctantly and vaguely about his own. Nate's phone was always face down. He had never done that before. They were both comfortable with each other's personal space and had nothing to hide. Abby caught herself wanting to pick up the phone and see what was so important, but she stopped herself every time. It would have been a breach of trust. That evening, when she accidentally saw their joint credit card statement, something inside her stirred. Several large cash withdrawals at different ATMs around the city, at a time when Nate should have been at work. She tried to remember if he had mentioned any big purchases, but nothing came to mind. One morning she found a strange card with the Happy Horseshoe Casino logo in his jacket pocket. It was a plain cardboard rectangle with a fancy pattern on the back. Abby turned it over in her hands and put it back. After all, Nate might have clients connected to the casino. But the card kept nagging at her. That evening she casually asked, "Hey, that casino, Lucky Horseshoe, I think it was. Is it far from downtown?" Nate froze for a second, then shrugged. "No idea. Why?" "Oh, just a patient who works there as a croupier. She told some funny stories." "Oh, I see," he said, clearly relaxing and changing the subject. That same evening, Abby Googled the casino. It was an hour's drive from the city. Not that far, but definitely not on Nate's way home from work. The changes also affected their weekends. Nate increasingly came up with reasons to go away alone. Sometimes it was a meeting with a potential client, sometimes urgent business at the car dealership. Abby mentally noted that the dealership had not been open on weekends before, but she didn't say anything out loud. On the rare evenings when they were home together, Nate seemed distracted and a little jumpy. He would fall silent in the middle of a conversation, staring at one spot, then suddenly jump up and start pacing the room. When asked, he would reply, "Everything's fine. I'm just tired." Abby noticed that he was sleeping worse. Sometimes she would wake up in the middle of the night and see him sitting in the dark with his phone, feverishly calculating something on the calculator. In the morning, he always said it was work, calculations for clients, loan applications. Once he didn't come to his parents' house for Thanksgiving, even though they had flown to Portland especially for the holiday. He said he was sick. Abby went alone and spent the whole evening thinking up excuses for his absence, looking at her mother-in-law's worried face. A strange ritual developed in their home. Every morning, Nate would grab his laptop and check some websites. Abby caught glimpses of numbers, graphs, and tables. When she approached, he would always close the laptop lid a little more hastily than necessary. The first call from an unknown creditor caught Abby at work. A woman's voice asked how she could contact Nate Marshall about a missed payment. Abby was surprised. They only had mortgage payments, and they always paid them on time. "It must be a mistake," she said, and wrote down the caller's number. That evening, she asked Nate about the call. He dismissed it as a mistake and said he would look into it tomorrow. But something in his voice made her wary. He spoke too quickly, too casually, as if he wanted to drop the subject as soon as possible. A week later, a letter arrived from the bank. Abby accidentally opened it. They never shared their mail. Whoever checked the box first took it. It was a notice of a late payment on a credit card she didn't know she had. "It's a work card," Nate explained. The salon gave it to me for business expenses. I forgot to tell you. But when she asked his colleague for the name of the bank, it turned out that the salon worked with a completely different financial institution. Their joint account began to dwindle. At first it was imperceptible, a couple of hundred here, a couple of hundred there. Then it got faster. Nate always had explanations: unexpected car expenses, helping a friend, some investment in a promising project. For their anniversary, he gave her an expensive bracelet. Abby was touched until she accidentally found the receipt. The jewelry had been purchased on credit. "Why?" she asked. "We had savings." "I wanted to get you something special," he smiled. "Don't worry, I've got it all figured out." But her anxiety grew. Abby began to notice that their credit card was being declined more and more often in stores. Nate said it was system glitches, technical problems that the bank promised to fix everything. The lies became more obvious and absurd. Once, he didn't show up for an important dinner with her colleagues, citing an urgent business trip. The next day, she accidentally saw his car in the parking lot of a shopping center. He started missing house payments. The first time, he explained it was a delay in his salary. The second time, he blamed some problems with a bank transfer. The third time, he simply said that he would sort everything out and that she shouldn't worry. Calls from creditors became more frequent. Now they were calling her phone too. Apparently, Nate had stopped answering their calls. Each time she passed on their messages to him, and each time he came up with new excuses. "It's a misunderstanding. I've already arranged a restructuring. They mixed up the dates. Everything will be sorted out tomorrow." She found strange receipts in his pockets, printouts of some transfers, notes with numbers. When she asked him about them, he always had a ready explanation, but they became less and less plausible. One morning, the bank called and said their house could be auctioned off because of a missed mortgage payment. Abby was shocked. She had personally made sure her part of the payment was always made on time. It turned out that Nate had secretly taken out a second mortgage on the house. "It's temporary," he assured her. "Just a little financial difficulty. I've got a big deal coming up and I'll pay it all off." But there was no big deal, nor were there any of the clients he claimed to be meeting with. Abby called the car dealership and found out that Nate's sales had dropped to almost nothing. He started borrowing money from friends. Abby found out when a friend called and cautiously asked if everything was okay. Nate hadn't paid back his debt for 3 months. Every conversation about money turned into a sophisticated verbal balancing act. Nate evaded direct answers, changed the subject, and promised to explain everything later. Sometimes he became aggressive, accusing her of distrust and pettiness. Their credit rating plummeted. Abby found out when she was denied a loan for new medical equipment for the clinic she was planning to open. She had always been careful with money, but their joint finances were hopelessly ruined. One evening, she found a letter from a casino in his papers demanding payment of a debt. The amount was astronomical. Nate swore it was fake, that someone was trying to blackmail them. He looked so convincing that for a moment she almost believed him. Lies became part of their daily lives. They hid in the short phone calls Nate made in whispers from the bathroom. They hid in his sudden business trips and late nights home. They lived in endless promises that everything would be fine soon. That Tuesday morning was no different from hundreds of others. Abby was getting ready for work. Nate was digging through his laptop. He seemed unusually calm, even peaceful, for the first time in months. "I'm going fishing this weekend," he said over breakfast, buttering his toast. "I'll get some fresh air, think about things." Abby raised her eyebrows in surprise. Nate had never been into fishing. In all their years of marriage, he had only gone to the lake a couple of times with colleagues, and that was more for the company. "Who are you going with?" "Alone. I want some peace and quiet." She wanted to ask more, but the phone rang. A call from the hospital, an emergency patient. After a quick goodbye, Abby left for work. It was a busy day. a string of patients, a consultation, and emergency surgery on a child. She got home late in the evening. Nate was sitting in the living room looking through some papers. When she appeared, he quickly put them in a folder. "Are you having dinner?" Abby asked, looking in the refrigerator. "I already had a snack. Listen." He paused. "I'm sorry for everything. For the debts. For the lies. I'll fix everything, I promise." There was something strange in his voice. Sincerity? Remorse? Abby couldn't tell. She was so tired of his promises. "Let's talk tomorrow," she said. "I'm exhausted." She woke up in the middle of the night to a noise. Nate was walking around the house, moving things around, opening and closing drawers. When she asked him sleepily, he replied that he was looking for an old fishing rod. He wanted to get ready for fishing in advance. He was already gone when she woke up in the morning. There was a note on the kitchen table. "I love you. I'm sorry for everything." And signed simply, N. Abby crumpled the note. How many times had she heard those apologies? How many times had he promised to change? None of that mattered anymore. The day passed as usual. Patients, procedures, filling out medical records. She stayed late at work to finish her reports. Her phone was silent, not a single call from Nate. Silence greeted her when she got home. There was a message on the answering machine from his mother just asking how things were. Abby didn't call back. She noticed that some of Nate's things were missing. His favorite leather jacket, the expensive watch she had given him last Christmas. But most of his clothes were still in the closet, as if he were planning to come back. His study was perfectly tidy, which was unusual for Nate. All the papers were neatly stacked. The desk drawers were empty. Only the trash can contained scraps of documents. Their wedding photos still hung on the wall. They looked so happy, so confident about the future. Abby stared at the picture for a long time, then turned off the light and went to bed. She couldn't sleep that night. She tossed and turned, listening to the sounds of the house. Water dripped somewhere, the clock ticked, the refrigerator hummed. These were ordinary, everyday sounds, but for some reason they seemed especially loud that night. Towards morning, she dreamed about Nate. He was standing by the lake with a fishing rod and saying something, but she couldn't make out the words. When she woke up, she couldn't remember if it was a dream or a memory. She left for work earlier than usual. She sat for a long time in the empty office, staring out the window at the waking city, her coffee growing cold. A new day was beginning. The last day she still considered herself Nate Marshall's wife. Nate arrived at Crater Lake early in the morning. He had deliberately chosen a weekday so there would be fewer witnesses. He parked his pickup truck in the gravel parking lot by the pier and slowly unloaded his fishing gear. His movements were calm and confident. He had been rehearsing them for several days. An elderly caretaker was standing by the boat rental. Nate showed him his license, filled out the logbook, and paid in cash. His hands weren't shaking. He had practiced staying calm in front of the mirror. The main thing was not to fuss or attract attention. "The bite's not great today," the attendant remarked good-naturedly as he handed him a life jacket. "And the weather's getting worse." "That's okay. I'm in no hurry." Nate even managed a smile. He loaded his gear into the small aluminum boat. A thermos of coffee, a folding chair, a box of bait, everything he needed. In the wallet he was going to forget in his vest pocket were his driver's license, a few small bills, and a short note for Abby. The motor started on the first try. Nate slowly maneuvered the boat out of the cove, heading for the far shore. The wind was picking up, but that was actually convenient. Bad weather would make his disappearance more plausible. In the middle of the lake, he turned off the motor. He took a change of clothes, documents in the name of David Brooks, and a phone with a new SIM card out of his backpack. He put everything in a waterproof bag. For the next half hour, he methodically created signs of a struggle. He knocked over the chair, scattered the fishing gear, and scratched the side of the boat. He took off his wedding ring, hesitated for a second, looking at it, then put it in his wallet. When everything was ready, Nate put on the wetsuit he had hidden. He had brought it here earlier, hiding it in the bushes near the shore in a waterproof bag. He checked the lightweight scuba gear, enough for 20 minutes of underwater diving. The waves were already rocking the boat violently. Nate looked back one last time. The shore was barely visible in the fog. Perfect conditions. He turned the motor on low speed, steering the boat toward the shore, and slid into the water. The cold penetrated even through his wetsuit. Nate dove deeper. The current was weaker here. He had calculated the time and place precisely. Half a mile downstream, his car was waiting for him. Underwater, the sounds became muffled and unreal. Nate swam slowly, trying to conserve air. Somewhere above him, his pickup truck was parked in the lot, and the empty boat was drifting toward the shore. In a few hours, the search would begin, but they wouldn't be looking in the right place. When he finally made it ashore in a secluded cove, it was already getting dark. He changed his clothes and hid his wetsuit and scuba gear in a prearranged hiding place. In the trunk of his Honda was a bag with cash and new documents. Nate started the engine. It was an 8-hour drive to the Canadian border. A new life was beginning right now. Local rescuers were the first to arrive at the lake. The caretaker had called them when it got dark and the boat still hadn't returned. In the light of the searchlights, they found it near the far shore, empty with scattered gear and signs of a struggle on board. By midnight, a full-scale search operation was underway. The county police arrived along with another rescue team and local volunteers. The area around the lake was divided into sectors. The shore was combed with flashlights, but in such darkness it was useless. At dawn, divers joined the search. Abby arrived just as they were preparing their equipment. She watched silently as they got ready, wrapped in her jacket. It was a chilly morning. "Mrs. Marshall?" Sheriff Donovan, a middle-aged man with a tired face, approached her. "We need to ask you a few questions. It's just a formality, but—" She answered mechanically. No, her husband rarely went fishing. Yes, he had been depressed lately because of financial problems. No, he had never talked about suicide. Meanwhile, the divers methodically searched the bottom. Visibility was poor and the current was strong. They worked in pairs, holding onto a guide rope. By lunchtime, a local TV crew had arrived. A reporter in a bright yellow jacket tried to interview Abby, but the sheriff politely pushed her away. Nate's parents arrived. His mother cried. His father remained silent. They settled in the rescue tent, occasionally going out to look at the lake, as if hoping to see their son alive and unharmed. The divers took turns every 2 hours. They brought up various debris to the surface, old cans, pieces of wire, scraps of nets. There was no body. By the evening of the second day, the search was expanded. Patrol boats searched the entire lake. Dog handlers with dogs worked on the shore. One of the dogs picked up a scent from the pickup truck but lost it at the water's edge. Investigators interviewed witnesses. The caretaker described Nate's appearance and behavior in detail. A waitress from a roadside diner recalled that he seemed distracted. A gas station attendant was sure he had seen him, but couldn't remember any details. On the third day, special equipment was brought in, a sonar device for searching for objects at the bottom of the lake. Abby sat in the rescue vehicle, staring at the monitor screen. There were blurry shadows floating around, resembling strange sea creatures. A press conference was called. The sheriff read a dry report. The scene had been examined. Witnesses had been interviewed and the search was continuing. Journalists asked questions, but the answers were vague. By the end of the week, the search began to wind down. Divers searched all possible places where the body could have been carried. The shoreline was combed several times. Even the service dogs got tired and lost interest. Sheriff Donovan called Abby to the station. His office smelled of coffee and old papers. He spent a long time explaining to her about the currents, the peculiarities of the lake bed, and how often the bodies of missing persons are never found. The police report was short. The presumed cause of death was an accident on the water. The body was not found. The case was left open. Nate's pickup truck was towed to an impound lot. His belongings were packed into cardboard boxes and returned to his family. The rescuers took down their tent and hauled away their equipment. The lake returned to its normal life. Occasionally, fishermen would come by and moor at the old pier, where the elderly caretaker was still on duty. He told them the story of the missing fishermen and showed them where they found the empty boat. Abby never returned to the lake, but sometimes at night she dreamed of dark water and woke up feeling like she was drowning. In the police archives, the file on Nate Marshall was covered in dust. It was just another unsolved case, one of many that every provincial lake has. The stack of envelopes on the table grew every day. Letters from banks, insurance companies, credit organizations. Abby methodically opened each one, sorted the documents into folders, trying to bring order to the financial chaos left behind by Nate. The phone rang incessantly. At first, it was polite bank employees reminding her of overdue payments. Then they were replaced by more insistent voices from collection agencies. Abby turned off her landline and changed her cell phone number, but somehow they found it too. Every day brought new discoveries. A credit card she didn't know she had. Her mother's jewelry, which she thought was safely locked away in a safe. Receipts from pawn shops. Loan agreements with some shady financial companies. At the bank where they had a joint account, she was shown statements for the last year. Large cash withdrawals, strange transfers to unfamiliar accounts. The manager shook his head sympathetically, explaining that their credit rating was hopelessly ruined. One morning, she discovered that she couldn't pay for gas with her card. All her accounts had been frozen. The bank had begun foreclosure proceedings. At work, she was called to the accounting department. A writ of attachment had been issued for part of her salary. The debt collectors became more and more insistent. They called her colleagues at the hospital, her neighbors, and Nate's parents. One day, she found them at her house, two burly men in identical dark suits. They didn't threaten her. They just stood there watching her park her car. She had to sell her car. Nate's old Ford went to the creditors, and her Honda was sold for next to nothing to pay off the most urgent debts. Now she took the bus to work, trying not to notice the sympathetic glances of her acquaintances. She had to put her house up for sale. The mortgage payments were eating up almost her entire salary. The realtor said something about it being a bad time for the real estate market, about falling prices. But Abby wasn't listening anymore. She methodically packed her things, sorting them into needed and past. Nate's parents tried to help, offering money, but she refused. These were her problems, or rather her husband's problems, which had become her inheritance. At night, she woke up from nightmares in which she was drowning in a sea of papers stamped overdue. During the day, she tried to keep it together. Her job required composure. Patients don't need a doctor with shaky hands. But the debts weren't the worst part. One evening, people who had nothing to do with banks or collection agencies knocked on her door. They didn't introduce themselves, just handed her an envelope with numbers on it. The amount Nate owed to some very serious people. Their calm voices and polite smiles sent a chill down her spine. Abby started looking for a cheaper apartment, a worse neighborhood, but one she could afford. Boxes of belongings piled up in the living room like tombstones of her former life. In one of them, she found their wedding photo and stared at the smiling Nate for a long time, trying to figure out when exactly he had started to become a stranger. Abby rarely went to the River Mall. It was on the other side of town. But that Thursday, she needed to buy a gift for a little patient who was finally recovering from a serious operation, and this was where she found a shop selling rare stuffed animals. It was a cloudy day and there weren't many people around. Abby slowly walked around the second floor, looking at the shop windows. She hadn't been shopping much lately. She didn't have the money or the mood for it. But today she needed a break from the endless calls from debt collectors and threatening letters. She had just picked out a funny purple elephant with big ears, paid, and left the store. The cafe across the street smelled of fresh pastries, and Abby decided to have a coffee. For the first time in a long time, she could afford to just sit in a cafe. Sitting at a table by the window, she watched the occasional passers-by. An elderly couple holding hands, a mother with 2 children laden with bags, a young man in a business suit hurrying somewhere with a briefcase. Ordinary people, an ordinary day. And then she saw him. Nate was sitting in the cafe across the aisle. He was wearing a light-colored shirt and dark pants, an unusual office style for him. His hair was cut short and he had a light stubble on his face. He looked lively and healthy, completely unlike a drowned man. Next to him sat a young woman with light hair and an elegant dress. She was talking animatedly, and Nate listened with the same half-smile that Abby had once loved so much. Then he leaned over and kissed her companion, lightly, familiarly, the way you kiss someone you love. The cup in Abby's hands trembled, and a few drops of coffee fell onto the table. She watched Nate laugh at something, fix his hair with a familiar gesture, take out his phone, and quickly type something. At one point he looked up and froze. Their eyes met through the glass partition between the cafes. Surprise flashed across his face, then fear, then something like shame. He jerked as if to stand up, but remained seated. His companion asked him something, looking worriedly at his suddenly pale face. Nate shook his head, trying to smile, but the smile came out crooked and unnatural. Abby slowly finished her coffee, staring straight at him. She could see how nervous he was, how his fingers were fidgeting with the napkin, how he was trying to pretend he didn't notice her. Nate's companion turned around, following his gaze, but to her, Abby was just a stranger at a table. After paying, Abby got up and headed for the exit. As she passed their table, she slowed down for a second. Nate slumped in his chair, avoiding her gaze. He smelled of unfamiliar cologne. His companion smiled at her, a polite smile to a stranger. A ring sparkled on her ring finger, not an engagement ring, just a pretty piece of jewelry with a stone. Leaving the mall, Abby got into her car. The bag with the stuffed elephant was on the passenger seat. She took out her phone. Several missed calls from debt collectors. Somewhere out there, in a cafe, sat her husband, officially dead for 6 months. Alive, healthy, building a new life with another woman. And she was left with his debts, threats from creditors, and a ruined life. In the rearview mirror, she saw Nate rush out of the mall. He looked around but didn't recognize her car. She had to sell her old Ford a long time ago. Abby started the engine and drove out of the parking lot. At the traffic light, she took out the business card that some serious people had left a few days ago. A white rectangle with a phone number, no name or title. It was time to deal with her inheritance. The card had been lying on the kitchen table for a week. The white rectangle with black numbers caught her eye every morning as Abby drank her coffee before work. She remembered the calm, slightly mocking look of the man who had left it. "We have some interests in common, Mrs. Marshall. Call me when you're ready to discuss them." After the meeting at the mall, something changed. The anger that had been building up for months turned into cold determination. Abby took out all the documents related to Nate's debts and laid them out on the table. That evening she called her friend Susan, who was a lawyer. Susan arrived with a bottle of wine and professional curiosity. "So he's alive," Susan said, looking through the papers. "And you want to sell his debts?" "Yes. There are people willing to buy them. Debt collectors?" "Not exactly," Abby said, remembering the well-groomed man in the expensive suit. "More like private lenders." Susan frowned. "That could be dangerous. People like that usually use less than legal methods of collection. I don't care. You do. Otherwise, you wouldn't have called me for advice. They talked until midnight. Susan explained the legal intricacies of debt assignment, the risks, and the possible consequences. Abby listened attentively, taking notes in her notebook. The next day, she took the day off and went to the office of a large debt collection agency. The lobby greeted her with a buzz of voices. Dozens of people wearing headphones were methodically calling debtors. The manager, a young man with a keen gaze, listened attentively to her story. "We could buy part of the debt," he said, "but not all of it. The amount is too large and the prospects for recovery are unclear." "Why unclear? I know he's alive. It won't be easy to prove, and without proof." He spread his hands. The next stop was the bank where she and Nate had once had a joint account. An elderly clerk studied the documents for a long time, then shook his head. "Unfortunately, the bank does not buy bad debts from private individuals." In the evening, she opened her laptop and started looking for information about companies that buy debts. She made calls, wrote down numbers, and compared offers. All of them were much lower than the amount of the debt, from 10 to 30 cents on the dollar. On Friday, she met with a representative of a small investment company. He offered good terms, but something about his manner was alarming. Too many promises, too much pressure to sign the papers right then and there. On Saturday, she drove to the other side of town to an inconspicuous office on the first floor. A security guard escorted her to a meeting room where a gray-haired man with a military bearing was waiting for her. He listened carefully and looked at the documents. "We deal with these kinds of things," he said, "but we have our own methods. You need to understand what you're getting into." Abby understood. She had spent a week researching her options and had come to the conclusion that the official authorities were powerless here. She needed people who had their own ways of finding debtors and making them pay. At home, she took out the business card with the black numbers again. She sat down at her desk and laid out all the offers she had received during the week. The most lucrative was from the people with the business card, 25 cents on the dollar, but it wasn't just about the money. On Sunday, she went to the cemetery where Nate's grave was. She stood by the gray stone, remembering his face in the shopping mall. Lively, smiling, carefree. She remembered the light-haired woman next to him, the new ring on her finger. In the evening, she took out her phone and dialed the number from the business card. Someone answered after the first ring. "Mr. Hoffman, this is Abby Marshall. I'm ready to discuss your offer." The meeting was set for the next day at a small cafe in the business district. Abby put down the phone and felt relieved for the first time in a long time. The decision had been made. On Monday morning, she gathered all the documents into a folder. She also put in the printed photo she had secretly taken at the mall, Nate and his new girlfriend at a table in the cafe. Maybe these people would find it useful. She took a week off work, her first vacation in 6 months. There was a lot of paperwork, meetings, and discussions to come. But the most important thing had been done. She had found a way to pass on her legacy to someone she trusted. The Bluebird Café was located in the business district, surrounded by glass skyscrapers. Abby arrived 15 minutes early. She ordered a coffee, sat down at a table in the corner, and took out a folder with documents. Michael Hoffman appeared right on time. Today he was wearing a light gray suit and a snow-white shirt. He was followed by 2 men, a young man with a leather briefcase and a stocky man who remained standing at the entrance. "Good morning, Mrs. Marshall," Hoffman said, sitting down across from her. The young man sat down next to him, opened his briefcase, and took out a laptop. "We have prepared the documents," Hoffman continued. "A standard assignment agreement, transfer deeds, and a confidentiality agreement. Jeremy will show you everything." The young man turned the laptop toward Abby. She read carefully, poring over every point. The wording was clear, with no legal loopholes. The amount was unexpectedly generous, 60% of the total debt, payable within 3 banking days. It was enough to pay off all the personal loans she had taken out over the past few months and start her life with a clean slate. "Why so much?" she asked bluntly. Hoffman smiled. "Let's just say we're very interested in this case, and we appreciate your cooperation. Any questions?" "Yes. What happens after I sign?" "It won't concern you anymore. We'll take over all debt collection obligations. You get the money and forget about this story." Abby took out her folder. "Here are all the original receipts, contracts, bank statements, and something else." She placed a photo from the shopping center on the table. Hoffman glanced at it and nodded. "We know. Our people have seen him too. David Brooks, that's what he calls himself now. He works for a construction company and rents an apartment in the suburbs. He leads a fairly comfortable life." "Have you been watching him for long?" "Long enough. We don't like to rush things." Jeremy turned the documents toward her to sign. While she read, the waitress brought more coffee. Hoffman sipped it slowly, waiting patiently. "Here," Jeremy pointed to where she should sign, "and here, an initial every page." The pen left clear blue lines. Signature, signature, signature. With each stroke, the burden of the past became lighter. "The money will be in your account tomorrow morning," Hoffman said, taking the documents. "Here's the receipt for the originals." "That's it?" "That's it. You no longer have anything to do with these debts. They're ours now." Jeremy gathered the papers into his briefcase. Hoffman finished his coffee and dabbed his lips with a napkin. "A word of advice for the future, Mrs. Marshall," he said, standing up. "Change your phone number and email address, just in case. He might try to contact me." "It's unlikely he'll have the opportunity," Hoffman smiled slightly, "but it's better to be safe than sorry." They left as organized as they had arrived. Jeremy with his briefcase, the silent security guard, Hoffman holding the door open. Abby remained seated, staring at her empty cup. The amount they had offered her seemed unreal. She was already calculating in her head: pay off her credit card, pay off her car loan, make the down payment on a new apartment, and she would still have enough left over to start saving for her own practice. That evening she checked her email and found confirmation that the assignment agreement had been registered. Dry legal wording, stamps, signatures, the end of the story. The next morning, the money arrived in her account, a large sum that could change her life. She closed her online bank account and went to work. A week later, she changed her phone number and got a new email address. 2 weeks later, she found a nice apartment in a prestigious neighborhood. She packed her things, taking nothing that reminded her of her past life. The document signed in the cafe became a watershed. Now there was only her job, her new life. And somewhere out there, in another city, a man named David Brooks did not yet know that very serious people with very serious intentions would soon appear in his life. Nate, now known as David Brooks, loved his new life. His job at a construction company was going well. He quickly rose to the position of senior sales manager. His girlfriend Melanie was an interior designer, and they often went to client meetings together. The past seemed like a distant nightmare that would never return. The first warning signs appeared a week after he accidentally ran into Abby at the mall. First, his favorite coffee table disappeared, the one where he had sat with Melanie that day. The cafe owner shrugged, saying they were closed for renovations and would reopen soon in a new location. Then he noticed that his house was being watched. Nothing obvious, just the same car in the parking lot, strangers who seemed to be in the neighborhood by chance. Strange things started happening at work. Clients unexpectedly canceled deals that had already been agreed upon. The accounting department delayed his commissions. His boss became colder and more distant. One morning he found an envelope on his desk. Inside were photos of himself in various locations around the city, copies of documents in the name of Nate Marshall, and bank statements showing unpaid debts. There was also a short note: "We need to talk." He tried to leave that same day. He gathered his essentials and booked a plane ticket. But at the airport, his card suddenly stopped working. All his accounts were blocked. In the taxi on the way home, he frantically considered his options. He could try to leave by bus. He had a little cash. Or he could hide out at a friend's place for a while. Or the taxi stopped at his house. A man in a gray suit was sitting on a bench near the entrance. "Good evening, Mr. Marshall," he said, standing up. "Or would you prefer Mr. Brooks?" There was no threat in his voice, only the calm confidence of a man who knew exactly where his interlocutor stood. "My name is Michael Hoffman. I represent the new owners of your debt obligations. I suggest we discuss the terms of repayment." The conversation was brief. Hoffman named a figure, double what Nate remembered: interest, penalties, late fees. "You have a week to begin repayment," Hoffman said, standing up. "Otherwise, we will be forced to use more persuasive measures." He left his business card, the same one he had given Abby. Nate stared at the white rectangle with black numbers for a long time. That evening, Melanie called. She had been promoted and would be working in another city. He knew it was no coincidence, just as it was no accident that his favorite bar had closed and the gym had suddenly terminated his contract. They were methodically destroying his new life, step by step, without unnecessary noise or obvious threats. They were simply cutting off his oxygen supply, his job, his entertainment, his relationships. 3 days later, he was fired. Officially, it was due to staff reductions. However, he had seen the same white rectangle with black numbers on his boss's desk. In the evening, there was a knock at the door. A stocky man with an expressionless face stood on the threshold. "Time is running out, Mr. Marshall," he said. "The boss wants to know when you'll start making payments." By the end of the week, Nate realized he was cornered. His new identity was crumbling like a house of cards. The documents in David Brooks' name suddenly had some inaccuracies. His credit cards were blocked. His accounts were frozen. He tried to contact the man who had once helped him fake his death. The phone didn't answer, and the address turned out to be fake. On Friday evening, the phone rang in his apartment. Hoffman sounded as calm as ever. "Time's up, Mr. Marshall. Tomorrow morning we're going to take more aggressive action. I advise you not to complicate the situation." Nate sat in the dark, staring at the flashing screen of his phone. Somewhere in the city, Abby was living her life, unaware of the revenge she had set in motion simply by passing his debts on to the right people. Abby's small private clinic had opened in early spring. 3 offices, a cozy reception area with a children's corner, and the most modern equipment. Her dream had finally come true. The workday began at 9. Abby arrived a little earlier. She loved those quiet morning moments when she could calmly drink her coffee and review patient records. Rachel, the nurse hired a month ago, was already sorting cards and preparing the offices for the day. The year had flown by. Abby had moved into a bright apartment in a nice neighborhood and gradually furnished it to her taste. She bought a used but reliable Volvo. She paid off all her debts. She even started saving a little for the future. That morning she was sorting through the mail when the phone rang. It was Susan, her lawyer friend. "Turn on the news," she said without preamble. "Channel 21. The TV in the reception area was showing the usual morning news. A reporter stood in front of a courthouse, reporting on a case involving a major fraudster who had faked his own death to avoid paying his debts. The camera showed a man in handcuffs, a gaunt, aged Nate. Abby stared at the screen with a kind of detached interest. The man in the frame seemed like a stranger, like a character from an old movie she had once seen. Later she read the details online. He had been found in a small town in Mexico, working as a bartender in a beach hotel and living in a room next to the bar. All his savings had disappeared, and the documents in the name of David Brooks turned out to be invalid. In the evening, Nate's mother called, crying and asking her to come to the court to support her son. Abby politely declined. She had an important appointment, and besides, this story no longer concerned her. Life went on as usual. The clinic gradually gained popularity, with more and more patients coming on recommendation. Abby liked working for herself. She could devote as much time as necessary to each child without having to worry about hospital standards. In her free time, she started going to yoga classes and signed up for Spanish lessons. She made new friends, without a shadow of her past, without awkward questions about her ex-husband. One day, Hoffman sat down at the cafe where she was having lunch. He was as impeccable as ever in his gray suit. "How are you, Mrs. Marshall?" "Just Abby Rose now. I took back my maiden name." He nodded understandingly. "Good choice. By the way, your ex-husband wasn't the most pleasant client. It took a lot of time to convince him that we were serious. I saw the news." "That's just the official version of the story," Hoffman smiled. "There's also the unofficial version, about how a man lost everything he tried to get through deception. His job, his reputation, his relationships, his money, little by little, day by day. You do your job well. We're just restoring justice, to each according to his deeds." He left as quietly as he had appeared. Abby finished her coffee and drove back to the clinic. She had an appointment. That evening, she stood at the window for a long time, looking at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in a holding cell, sat the man she had once loved, a man who had betrayed her trust and destroyed their life together. Now he was getting what he deserved, not from her, but from the very serious people to whom she had sold his debts. The divorce papers lay on the table, the last formality that needed to be taken care of. Tomorrow she would take them to her lawyer, and this story would finally become part of the past. In the morning, she woke up feeling light. Ahead of her was a normal workday, patients, paperwork, phone calls, the ordinary life of an ordinary person without drama or turmoil, exactly as it should be. The new chapter in her life didn't begin when she signed the contract with Hoffman, nor was it when she saw Nate on the news. It was now, when she finally realized that the past no longer had power over her. She got into her car and drove to the clinic. The day promised to be a good one, sunny, calm, and completely ordinary.